Speech will be starting in 3, 2, and 1. This debate doesn't just stop at cooperating peacefully with other countries and magically form peaceful negotiations, but rather on the practical side. Is increasing military cooperation really a smart move for ASEAN altogether? Because there are a couple of questions that both sides need to answer in this debate. First of all, how will this actually affect countries within ASEAN? And what does this increasing military cooperation actually look like? Because if you notice, proposition never gives us an actual framing on how this looks like or how countries are going to operate or cooperate with each other peacefully and how trust is going to form. Instead, they keep making assumptions which we will address later on and still rebut them altogether. And the third question is that what exactly is ASEAN's role in this military cooperation? On our side, we have effectively answered all of these questions, and this speech will further deepen on our side's case. Before we move on to the clashes and rebuttals, let's move to the clarifications, right? Because there are a couple of laws made by proposition, and we believe that others should not be swayed or should not be persuaded by all of these claims made by proposition. First of all, they talked about how they completely assume the fact that military cooperation will unite the world together and build better relationships. This has been strengthened and emphasized from first speech to third speech. And this, we believe here, does not happen overnight. And ASEAN does not need to cooperate with external parties on military cooperation to form better reputation in the world, because what ASEAN truly needs is actually the following. Number one is ASEAN, they have like a neutral stance, right? This basically risks alienating external powers like, for example, China, US, India, who have interests in Southeast Asia. And if they involve themselves in this altogether, this will undermine ASEAN's neutrality and their leverage in the diplomatic world. Second of all, their aim is non-interference and peaceful cooperation. Proposition has to understand that cooperation and alliance are two completely different things. If ASEAN indulges themselves too much in this military cooperation with other external parties like China or India, they basically risk losing their stance, which is an obvious negative harm from the proposition. You may ask why this stance is so important, because proposition may argue that they could have widened their social circles and built relationships with other members, and their stance is not so important. However, ASEAN has long been known for initiatives such as peaceful growth and well-led leadership. And if they involve themselves in this increasing military world, it's not a smart move, because many ASEAN members have overlapping territorial disputes, for example, the South China Sea. And many integration without resolving these disputes could actually could actually lead to increased suspicion between members, not actually decrease it, and conflicts can still happen whether or not we have increased military cooperation. So moving on to the clashes, right? We believe there are two important clashes that needs to be tackled in this debate. First of all is on trust and future growth, and second is on the long-term consequences. For trust and future growth, there are a couple of things that need to be remembered. First of all, trust only stems from deep understanding and the same global stance. This doesn't mean that countries that have different stances cannot cooperate. However, when it comes to military, technology, and other war-related weapons, it's a whole different level. Trust doesn't just happen overnight, and increased military cooperation will not do anything in return to help this. Now, what has proposition said? First of all, they talked about how this will be cultural exchange, how this will deepen relationship and mutual understanding. This debate isn't about whether military cooperation and sharing intelligent knowledge is beneficial or not. Of course, cooperation is needed and mutual understanding is needed. However, the keyword here is the increased involvement of external parties that can potentially swing the mindset and stance of ASEAN. And on our side, we're able to prove the fact that it's not that important for ASEAN to have increased increased cooperation when it comes to military. And our first and second speakers have already proved to you how in return it can lead to more conflict and swing political stances from different countries. Secondly, they talked about how this will increase the military coup, it gives more advantages, and it allows room for more transparency. They emphasized on the word less conflict, and they also talked about how countries are smart enough to not create conflicts. They take the example of Vietnam, for example. If conflicts here is such a problem in this debate, my only question is, why don't we just lessen the military cooperation altogether? Because if this is so risky, why would ASEAN keep diving and deepening themselves into this big black hole? Because there'll be a risk of escalating regional tension, because many ASEAN members have overlapping, as we said, territorial disputes, right? And instead of actually building trust, it will just basically trigger arm races or push states to align with outside powers in order to balance the bloc, in order to balance their military stances in the global world. They also talk about the fact on build up reputation, right? Our only answer to this is that the military is not the answer for increased reputation. Nonetheless, it even actually reduces the trust from the public, because by then, the public will be confused of what exactly is happening to the world. There will be less control over the power of your own country, and not to mention this isn't the goal or aim of ASEAN in the first place, because for a lot of people, they're just confused about what is happening. For example, like nowadays, a lot of things has happened. America has having tariffs to all other countries, or there's just military trade, and a lot of countries are having war at the moment. And having increased military cooperation with other external parties will not actually resolve the conflict happening, and conflict will still happen no matter what. Finally, on the last clash is on long-term consequences, right? This is not to mention the possibilities of countries actually failing to keep up with the ever-changing status quo. Proposition has to keep in mind that poorer members must divert scarce funds from education, healthcare, or even climate change adaptation to keep up. This will create resentments inside the ASEAN. What are we actually paying for this? And it will even worsen the inequality between members as a whole. ASEAN unity is not going to happen, and strengthening will lessen altogether. And if a member later changes the government, or they just want neutrality and they don't want to involve themselves in this military cooperation with other external parties and equipment sharing, and they want to save this for their own country, it may risk even more conflict, and withdrawal could even trigger and could be a driving force in mistrust or even sanctions from other members as a whole. So basically, the overall outcome is that ASEAN ends up locked into a path that it can never ever get out of in this democratically debate world. And overall on our side, what we have achieved is really simple. We're trying to prove to you how staying neutral should be the #1 aim. We're not disproving the fact that cooperation is important. We do believe it is, but however, supporting the increase of this within ASEAN for other external powers should not be the #1 priority within ASEAN. It risks losing a lot of factors, conflicts happening, neutrality is no longer a factor in ASEAN anymore, and that's why we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.